At the end of the presentation, I'm going to give everyone a superpower. So you've got something to look forward to. But we've got to go through a couple of steps to get there. Let me see if I can get my magic. So diagramming abstractions. I'll just start off because to appeal to my surrealist sentiments. Two flamingos. On the left, the sculptor Alexander Calder's flamingo in my hometown of Chicago in front of the Federal Plaza by Mies van der Rohe. And on the right, Phil Watson's AI-generated pink flamingo from his extraordinary experimental lab in the UK. And I just wanted to point out that in both cases, the flamingo is, as any entity in the world, in the sensible world, capable of producing an infinite number of representations from one singular entity. And this is something we'll come back to in a little bit in terms of multiplicity, but also towards the end, I'm going to try to convince everyone in the last half hour, which I think is from 7:30 to 8, I'm going to try to convince everyone here that they're a mutant in a good way and that they have a superpower. So bear with me as we move towards that. A little biohistory. Undergraduate in architecture, master's in architecture at Harvard, another master's, and then a PhD. So all my degrees are in architecture. I did minors in psychology, film, art history, philosophy, pretty much across the humanities. Graduation from the University of Florida, doing my Bachelor of Design. 11 of my friends, they were going to charge us $100 to exhibit at the end of year show. So my friend Jeff, who is a welder in the Oakland shipyards for 10 years before he came to architecture, we took a construction crane, modified it on his ranch, brought it in on a flatbed truck across the Florida mangrove swamps and the fog, spot welded it onto the architecture building to give the university a big finger, and we charge people money to come up in the tower and see our projects. Surprisingly, this going away present to the university backfired. The dean came over and asked who authorized this. I picked the professor that hated my guts and said he approved it. And all my friends ran up in the tower. Then 10 years later, I'm the dean chasing students away for doing the same kind of thing. But this is our first design build project I did as an undergraduate, which is, as you can see, a little bit influenced by Co-op Hummelbach. And it was all built from scrap materials to offer an observation point. I did my master's thesis at Harvard, analyzing the film Blade Runner every day. I wrote a paragraph of theory, did a diagram of one of the cross sections or mobile sections through the film, and then turned that diagram into a model. And at the end of the 60 days, I had 60 paragraphs, 60 diagrams, and 60 models. And I glued them together in the lower right hand, as you can see, and submitted it as a Master of Architecture thesis. So it's somewhere between high density Blade Runner, cyber urbanism, infrastructure, and working with different forms of, assemblage, but more precisely like a bricolage of the leftover urban detritus that was the basis for Ridley Scott's film when I saw it. And it was a very important film for me because I was actually too young to see it when I was young. So I had to sneak in a couple times before I actually saw it. And when I walked out, I said, I'll never live in a small place again. I've taught 55 studios around the world by my count, about 4,000 students, I think, in my career. So I've been academic most of my life. And a lot of the things we do in design studios, I often ask students to articulate some sort of conceptual relationship, defining a concept. Basically, at bare minimum, the molecule that produces a concept or an abstraction, to say, is one concept, a second concept, and some relationship between them. So, light surrounds knowledge, or good precedes evil. Work with two concepts and a verb, and then you have an abstraction. So this is what I would often teach undergraduates as the basic building block for developing projects, and that a good concept tells you how to detail at one-to-one scale, but also tells you how to integrate into the visible and invisible forces of the city at the same time as well. So a good concept is always scalable. Abstractions work because in many ways they're dematerialized, but they still have geometry implicit in them. And so this is where it gets, a lot of times I'd ask students to take a concept, build a study model bigger than their abdomen, and then from that try to figure out how to get from these, say, totemic objects into, in this case, at Georgia Tech. These were metro train stations. Right after I finished my PhD, I was hired at Illinois Institute of Technology, Mies van der Rohe's Crown Hall, to teach the history of modern thought and architecture, not modern architecture, but the history of modern thought and architecture, modern architecture. And one of the senior faculty who is very involved with Archigram named Peter Lang came over to me. He says, "Who are you?" I told him, and he says, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I just finished my PhD 6 weeks ago, and I've been hired to teach theory." And he said, "You shouldn't teach theory. It only confuses the students." And I was like, "Oh, are you asking me to void my contract?" He's like, "No, just don't put any theory in the theory classes and everything will be okay." And that was my first time teaching in this context, which was in many ways not just a temple of minimalism, but also quite a haunted environment in terms of everything from the ambient qualities of space to the manipulation of the transparency. A lot of my published research has been on the fringes of architectural theory, looking at primarily surrealism on the left, the hallucinogenic toreador from Salvador Dali. The Salvador Dali Museum, when I was a child, was built in our town of St. Petersburg, Florida. So I would spend many, many days at the Dali Museum before I became an architecture student, trying to understand the mysteries of representation, and also to think about the types of formal transformations that occur. And it was only much later when I was studying as an undergraduate and read Delirious New York, and with my already then pretty sophisticated knowledge of Salvador Dali's idea of paranoid critical methods and the type of plasticity and its almost photorealistic representations of hallucinations. It made perfect sense as how that segues into a lot of Rem Koolhaas's work at that time with OMA and their development of, I guess, landscape urbanism in particular here. They're unsuccessful, but I think better proposal for the Park Villette competition, which is done as a series of cinematic strips operating across the site to create a series of moving parts and juxtapositions of different I guess, event spaces distributed through an uneven space. Whereas in Dali's case, the foreground, midground, and background often start to play optical tricks with each other, in some ways subverting any of the clear boundaries between inside and outside, or in Dali's case, using high degrees of precision to articulate the irrational, almost to the level of photorealism, but they're actually, deliberately forced hallucinations in the paranoid critical method. A lot of the studios I've taught often have the students to work with found objects, found artifacts, repurposing, upcycling, reinterpreting in a kind of a bricoleur model, which was always very formative to me ever since I was exposed to Colin Rowe's writings in Collage City as an undergraduate, that the idea that things have not just multiple lives, but they have multiple possible means of attachment or connection, and that with every physical object, joint, detail, seam, gap, crevice, or opening, there is a radiant or like an apron of invisible possible connections and forces around it too. So everything that appears to be singular or anything that smacks of object permanence, more often than not, also has these invisible threads and tendrils of possible connection to other things too. In some ways, it's like the entire universe starts, if we follow this mentality, starts to become a kit of parts, but also in many ways having some sort of hidden secret circuitry that allows you to connect dissimilar items and dissimilar elements to each other. And that could be combining everything from mental abstractions to found debris, or to integrating different types of processes at different scales and trying to come up with junctures or joints that allow them to resonate with each other. I was very briefly a dean when I was in New Zealand, and that's where I learned a lot about not just ecologies, but ecosophical aesthetics, both from Felix Guattari's writings, but also from looking at the Maori cosmology and indigenous knowledge systems that are enshrined in New Zealand legislature, including the fact that the Maoris don't use any right angles in their representations because of the fundamental circular and repetitive nature of the organic forms that populate everything from the clouds to the volcanoes to the seas. And this is my, in my head, this is where I live now. This is an AI generated image, but this is what I'm working towards, the Esoteric Library of the Congra Valley. It's my personal book collection, assembled over many decades, that we use as a research center for pre-docs and postdocs to develop pretty unusual research projects that fall between the disciplinary boundaries or silos, what Jane Rendell called infra-disciplinary, something that falls between as opposed to deliberately connecting, and looking for those, again, those lines of flight or those lines of force that could bring obliquely or transversely two or more potentially unrelated, incommensurate, or unresolvable entities into close proximity so they start to do things, whether that's a knowledge system or urban situations or, I guess, forms of life. So a little bit about abstraction. Diagramming abstractions is fun. The abstraction, and particularly the idea of abstracting something, can be traced in one historical context, at least, to medieval scholasticism, where the abstraction was in many ways a distillation or a reduction of a complex situation to its bare minimum or its essential characteristics or qualities, in a sense, stripping off the timely to find the timeless. You find that manifesting itself in a lot of medieval manuscripts, particularly in the post-scholastic period, which is under the strong influence of the rediscovery of Aristotle and this idea of classifying things. In terms of subversive glossia, subversive marginal notes, here you can see a treatise, and there's a monkey climbing a pole that one of the monks has added as a type of commentary on the text. So there's a long tradition of commentary of text in other hands or through figural representations too. So you can find some diagrammatic logic, or as W.J.T. Mitchell called in his essay on diagrammatology, something that has almost like a deeper structure of indeterminacy that keeps requiring itself to be manifest over and over again, to like a working through would be the psychoanalytic term. But the other way to do that, to think about that maybe, is that abstraction is something you have to talk yourself into and something you have to persuade yourself of, as opposed to simply discovering it or finding it. Here's one aspect of the medieval manuscripts that were very popular in the 80s when I was studying my PhD, the medieval palimpsest. So a lot of the texts were written on very hard to obtain parchment, and more often than not, the recycling process, they would scrape off lesser texts and reinscribe new text. So here you can see electron microscope, actually I think that's pretty standard spectrometry, pulling out 3 different texts on the same sheet of parchment, each written in different periods and different topics. And they found many lost books actually this way. In contemporary times, even some translations of lost classical texts that were put onto these manuscripts and then shaved off or scraped off and then reinscribed too. And you can see it's almost this obviously was influencing filmmakers like Peter Greenaway, who I got to study with when I was at European graduate school, and talking about how there's always, worlds within worlds. And there's also, in his case, every surface is a surface of inscription, whether it's a human body or a camera lens. The mobilization, or we could even dare, if I follow Owen Hatherley's writings, the militarization of abstraction in modernity. In this case, almost like an encounter that didn't quite happen. This is a missed encounter constructed as a stage image. On the left, the very well-known Mies van der Rohe Seagram's building. A lot can be said about its Greek classical colonnade, its distinct spatial zoning, the clear passage from the exterior plaza, the first building in New York, to be set back from the property lines to create this almost skate punk friendly environment, and the contraction of all of the back of house functions into the zone. And in the Four Seasons restaurant, when Philip Johnson was involved in this project, they actually commissioned the painter Mark Rothko to do the paintings for the Four Seasons restaurant and the Seagrams. It eventually fell through, but I put this one of many fascinating spiritual color fields by Mark Rothko, and showing the formal similarities in terms of the spatial banding, but also the spatial bleeds that occur in this ultra minimalism of Mies and this ultra spirituality of Rothko. Again, it's a missed encounter. This work was almost placed in that building, but never did happen historically. And you can feel the tension between their apparent similarities, even though they're working at very different scales and very different mediums. And then this takes us to the idea of the psychogeographic. I learned a great deal about geography yesterday, going back again to my surrealist roots, and that if there is any such thing as a map, think in terms of palimpsests as well, every map has at least two forms of reception, a conscious and an unconscious reception. Walter Benjamin pointed this out when he wrote about the optical unconscious coming out of surrealism, but more precisely photography, and that images, maps, graphic representations communicate to us in two channels, at two levels simultaneously, one conscious and one unavailable to our conscious, but still communicating with our subconscious. So this is a core part of the psychoanalytic and surrealist models of 20th century image reception. Which also means that within any message, following, say, media theory of McLuhan, with any message, there's sub-messages that are being encoded and hidden within them, often outside of the control or even the knowledge of the creator or the author, which is perhaps where death of the author theory comes in, when the author says this means that, and I was like, no, it doesn't. How do you know? You're just the author. You don't know what the work means. We decide what the work means. In psychogeography, there's actually a radical attempt, going back to the situations even earlier, to try to create representations that feel like a space, but do not follow the explicit metric or striated space regimes that encode, I guess, locations and property values of that nature. So it's much more of an understanding of space as something that is in the context of a streaming media or streaming reality, or as I'm arguing, a two-level streaming reality. There's one that tends towards visual representation, symbolism, and abstraction. There's a second one, that's about the feels and the vibes, and sometimes, the uncanny coming in that lower level channel. And psychogeography is a set of practices, both in terms of literary, but also cinematic and cartographic, to try to capture that dualism between the world as seen and perceived and the world as felt, or the world as flow. And David Lynch, just working on a manuscript on David Lynch's Lost Highway. This is from Twin Peaks. You may not know the story if you ever saw David Lynch's Twin Peaks. This representation of the subconscious, which is actually the Red Room, is inaccessible. He touched a warm car hood, the top part, and had a spontaneous hallucination of this room filled with people who were speaking and walking in reverse. And it happened to him instantaneously, and then he made that the core place where all of the tensions in the Twin Peaks series and later the film, they're not resolved, they're aired out, they're articulated, they're abstracted, and then they go back into their dormant position too. So the subconscious as a space is a very important way of understanding. It's almost like the missing matter in a lot of modernity and a lot of modern works. The development of the psyche, and particularly psychoanalysis, is one of three triplets, all born in the 1850s. Psychoanalysis, modern architecture, and cinema are all siblings by date and by proximity. This was the basis for a lot of the work that we did when I did my book on surrealism and architecture, looking at, again, this multi-channel approach, that anything that has symbolism or abstractions will also contain with it dissonant or subverting flows and streaming media. And you can trace this principle back to some of the earliest cosmology machines. This is Ludwig Kertner. He was the internet before the internet existed. He wrote thousands of catalogs. And this is, at that time, a relatively well-known understanding of the harmony of the spheres. Here's the integration of nature as an image, where wisdom is coming as a lightning bolt from a cloud, and that's the cloud of unknowing from mystical texts. It comes down into the figure of Sophia, the representation of the divine principle of wisdom, standing on the earth, which has been, subdivided and organized and manifests a logic of centrality in the cosmos. And so everything in this clockwork universe, as Descartes called it many centuries later, operates with, at that time, what was perceived to be coming from the classical world, the idea of the celestial harmony or the music of the spheres, that the Earth is, at the center of this like Russian doll nested compilation of different levels of rarefied and increasingly ethereal levels of reality coming from the center and radiating outwards. And so in this case, geometry and abstraction give you the full picture of the engine of cosmology. And in modernity, if we look at, say, figure ground or field conditions, this distinction is from Stan Allen's essay on field conditions, probably like 40 years old now. He was on my thesis defense. We had a long conversation about this in relationship to Blade Runner, of all things, too. The Gestalt model of the figure ground, where there's an object and a field condition, and particularly in the development of high modernity and interwar and late modernity, increasingly fragmentation that comes from the over-articulation or hyper-articulation of the objects as fragments, and this almost gelatinous anti-space that holds increasingly as a hypothetical field condition and loses its figural quality, so that the space between buildings starts to increasingly become this non-space or this plenum. Whereas on the right, the diagram of from complexity science and chaos theory, in particular, of the strange attractor, something that is not immediately perceivable, but can be measured, coming from the field of data-generated complexity science, that there are certain phenomena that occur once a system reaches a higher degree of complexity. Spontaneous, not hallucinations, but spontaneous emergence of new forms, new figures, and new forces will occur. It's a type of, to put it in technical terms, a heterogenesis, not a homogenizing or simple genesis operation, but from a field of chaotic situations of increasing complexity. Emergence theory states that the new comes from basically going to the top level or the limit condition of a phase space or a degree of intensity, and then you jump levels, and then you're into a new space, and the world becomes new again. And this is also that cosmological principle reinterpreted through, I guess, not quantum physics, but through chaos theory itself. And Stan Allen was talking about how in his essay, his very seminal essay about field conditions, which is also a pun around site observation if you're an architect, that the field condition is actually a loose arrangement of different elements that may or may not have any sort of causal relationship or strong bonds between them, but it's composed entirely of implied weak ties, and you're in the boundary condition for a field condition or in field theory. Whether it applies to sociology, culture, or psychology, field theory often has weak boundaries and casual relationships between the elements in the set, and they can also accommodate things being put in and pulled out, which is very different from the more hardwired iron cage, solid void, black and white, Nolli map model figure ground relationships. And this creates the rates of change of two levels, this is the basis of calculus. And I remember I learned calculus in school, but it was only when I was taking business classes. If the rate of change outside of you is greater than the rate of change inside of you, then the end is near. That was one of the warnings that they offered us too. So the secret is always to have, and I as will appreciate this, to always have equal or greater degree of complexity and chaos than the world around you, so that not only you can keep up, but you can keep pushing things to their limit conditions and finding those loose and porous boundaries or the edges of implied field conditions, so that you can enter into the next phase state or the next field that lies beyond it. When we were undergraduates, a lot of us struggled to understand. I understood this intuitively, but a lot of my colleagues struggle with the idea of space as a negative. I tell non-architects and people who are not in design, I said architects actually design everything from the paint inwards. We just do drawings of the insulation, and we struggle to be smarter than raindrops. But ultimately, what happens is that all of the oxygen, all of the functionalism, everything that people actually value about the interiority or the built environment is in that ethereal, almost affective space between the walls. It's a negative. And it's only in cases where we start to read the negative as positive or to do a figure ground reversal. For example, this illustration from Vogue magazine, I'm sure Palladio would be offended, but I think it's actually very Palladian, even her clothing, the ballet dancer being dropped into the Palladian interior. Or Savino, the painter, who would take different types of oil paint on the right and drop it into water and then photograph it as it manifested this almost Baroque pleated idea of fabric and materiality. And it's basically just paint finding its own gravitational loads. And obviously you can imagine it's working around particular impurities, and no two experiments are the same. And, that's why you can never go into the same space twice. That's why I think, in my particular understanding of process philosophy, that all events are unrepeatable and unreproducible. Although much of our math and science and probably even law and scripture tells us that things are repeatable. Imagine a world where nothing ever repeats exactly the same. That was the idea that haunted Nietzsche. So another way to think about abstraction is the phenomenological approach of the body. Your body in phenomenology is a sensing organism. It's a device that, it's an instrument, let's call it, that not only makes sense of the world, but brings sense to the world simultaneously. So there's a reciprocating mechanism. You can find this at the idea is perhaps Merleau-Ponty is the most articulate here. That at the boundary of your body, there's a condition of flesh. And your flesh is not paper thin. It is not a surface. It is one of many layers going inwards. And the flesh of the world is something that is outside the flesh of the body, but still connected to it. So your body, and particularly the largest organ of your body, the skin, has the capacity to not just feel and touch things, but it can also sense temperature, humidity, here in Delhi, choking pollution. There's a lot of things that your sensory apparatus has that allows you to be a sensing mechanism beyond the limit condition of the body and the skin in particular. And so the ultimate boundary point of, say, your visual perception, if you're in a room like I am, the walls become the boundary point. Your ears can hear things in the next room or down the street, or sometimes coming straight from the angels, wherever those sounds are coming from. They also are extension of your sensing apparatus too. So you actually are operating at multiple scales simultaneously when you're sensing, and also the process of sensing is imposing a sense of order or sensing onto the world too. So it's very much a reciprocating, real-time, back and forth channel situation. And these images of the dance troupe, I think they're called Kronos. By leaving the camera lens open and dancing, you can start to see how abstraction comes into even the most non-abstract thing that we can think of, the human body, your sensing apparatus. And the flesh of the world in Merleau-Ponty is that explicit connection between the skin surface and outwards from the skin to the boundary condition of whatever space or environment you're in at the edge of your perception. And that too is a skin. And he says they're actually the same skin. And so that means that we're always occupying this crevice or this pocket between what is called, he calls it the flesh of the world. And it's not literally flesh. It has everything to do with, your perceived boundary conditions and how those would shift from moment to moment or space to space. A little bit about diagramming history. There's a little timeline here on the left. Back in the digital age, simultaneously with the rise of the digitization of the design professions and architecture in particular, in some ways it dismantled the overarching corporate effect, at least initially, because this technology of the digital deranged a lot of the systems of and apparatuses of capture and structures of communication. In professional practice class, we had to read essays from Chicago in the early 1900s about how the telephone was going to kill the reputation of the architect because clients would be able to call and ask the architect to do things instead of corresponding by mail. And now you can, now everybody's on speed dial. That seems to have come to be. At the time when the digital was still being theorized as the virtual, in architecture, there was a shift influenced by particularly the rediscovery of the writings of Gilles Deleuze and looking at his interest in the Baroque. But before that, there was a move in a lot of Derrida's early work. So these were the popular French theorists when I was a student. And Derrida's earliest work was actually on Husserl's origin of geometry, and the idea of the transcendental being something that is easier to determine in geometric shapes and geometric relationships than even in grammar. He changes position later. But that's an illustration at the top. That's from the cover of Derrida's first book on Husserl's origin of geometry. And that's a prosthetic nose. If you know the history of astronomy, Tycho Brahe was likely killed for his scientific observations, lost his nose in a duel in Denmark, and the king of Denmark had a golden nose made for him. And everyone's like, look, he must be the alchemist because he turned his own nose to gold. He was imprisoned by the prince in Prague Castle. I've been to his cell and his laboratory there, where Tycho Brahe was forced to come up with astronomical calculations to prove or disprove that the sun was the center of the universe, which he did have inconclusive data on it. But in the case of this image, I've constructed a diagram composed of other diagrams, which is also the logic of bricolage, where on the right you can start to see the effect of folding, which came out of Deleuze's writings about the Baroque and the idea of the pleats of matter and infinite extension, and how in calculus things can become incredibly big or incredibly small quickly, something that Alice in Wonderland demonstrates, because Lewis Carroll was obviously a mathematics professor at Oxford when he wrote this book for Alice Little to explain very complex geometrical mathematical principles like the law of identity and Humpty Dumpty. And I've done some research with some students on this too, about the secret mathematics and the secret ecologies in Alice in Wonderland, called Wonderland Mechanics. But the fold was the idea that something that appears solid or compact or statue-like is actually created mostly through folds and it's like croissant-like folds of matter in the universe with space between them. And that folding and unfolding, it became very popular in design schools to design buildings that were basically one continuous piece of paper. There was wall and roof and wall and parking lot and all these other things too. But this is kind of a very crude genealogy of the rise of the dominance of diagrams in architectural thinking, architectural theory from the 70s to about the turn of the century. Felix Guattari, distinct from Deleuze, defined the diagram. It's conceived as an autopoietic machine, which not only gives it a functional and material consistency, but requires it to deploy its diverse registers of alterity. This is the diagram, freeing it from an identity locked into simple structural relationships. So this is from his book on chaosmosis, which is actually getting into ego aesthetics. So just to unpack this for a minute, autopoiesis is a process whereby machines produce other machines. Allopoiesis is more like a black box function where something goes in and something different comes out, or it can only reproduce itself. Another way to think about it, allopoietic systems tend to be closed systems. Autopoietic systems are open systems. They have spontaneous emergence. They have mutation. If you run the same experiment 10 times, you get 10 different results, which the surrealists would love and the positivists absolutely hate. And so any sort of autopoiesis machine, which would include your subconscious, is constantly producing newness and difference. And this is why he said diagrams have to deploy diverse registers of alterity. So alterity is a coded word to describe what used to be called the stranger, say in existentialist theory, otherness in terms of post-colonial critiques perhaps. But alterity also means the unfamiliar. It also means the unexpected. It also means alterity is something that is different or deviant or something that is a mutation. And we'll come to that towards the end of today's workshop too. But this idea is that a diagram is not something that produces structure. It does not produce reproducibility. It produces uncertainty. And for him, this is why a diagram is a very type of autopoietic abstract machine. This is a diagram from A Thousand Plateaus, probably one of the most compelling and fascinating theory fictions. I think it's at the same level as Alice in Wonderland. It's a series of philosophical explorations of different types of geometries. And this is the idea of the centralized kingship system in structuralist anthropology and how you can escape that by basically opting out of either the patriarchy or the monarchy or any sort of heavily structured or codified environment in some ways. Waving your freak flag high, as Jimi Hendrix said. Fluxus diagram, I just grabbed one of many operating at the same time that Guattari was doing his work. Joseph Beuys and others also involved with the ecosophical movement looked at how to use the tools and devices of capitalism against capitalism. And so Fluxus in their works often would draw upon everything from incorporating television to going back to a deliberate retro-primitivism and reinscribing it using debris and found objects and detritus from the world. And this is literally a Fluxus diagram of lines of influence of the different artists. And you can see some of these are mapping everything from machines and happiness, but also it's a diagram of relations. And this is more often than not where I think the essence of diagramming comes from, not in terms of a flow chart that is descriptive or militaristic, or in some ways imperial. They would call that, say, state science or striated space. When I escaped the United States the second time, I did A-levels in England. I remember there was a sign I saw in London, and I think it was in a museum from the Royal Navy from the 1800s, and it said, "The floggings will continue until morale improves." And I always stuck with me too in terms of this idea of the iterative process. But diagrams have action implied in them. And in Guattari's model, that is a deviation. But the diagram is a device that provides deviations and not normalcy or consistency. Another way to say that is a diagram is something that destabilizes, particularly through its absence of high-res full degree disclosure or closure. Low-res diagrams are inherently, in McLuhan's theories and others, incomplete. They require someone to access them, read them, misinterpret them, elaborate them. When I worked at SOM and we had a project team of 600, they said, the more complicated the diagram, the more time you spend in meetings. And that was the bluntness of it. But the clear diagram is the effective way to mobilize all of the different intelligence agents. And I was briefly in Berlin on a Fulbright. I got to spend some time in Daniel Libeskin's office, and I had a brief chat with him. Mark Cousins actually called me the Forrest Gump of architecture. He's like, "You've met everybody once, haven't you?" I said, "Yeah, I have." And when I was in his office, we were discussing, this is part of his Chambers works, where he was taking Heraclitus's idea of a world of flow, a world of flux, and Heraclitus was a pre-Socratic, had a big influence on Nietzsche and a lot of the process philosophers of the 20th century, who in general believed, and this is not so much Daniel Libeskin or Heraclitus per se, but process philosophy, that there are no stable permanent objects. Instead, you have intensities and durations. You have worlds of flux and flow. And if you think about even that space from the paint inwards that you're in right now, it will change during the day in terms of its degree of light, its temperature, its pollen count. Everything is in a process of shifting or changing, sometimes dramatically, sometimes very slowly. And for me, this is why I place process philosophy at the center of thinking of things like abstraction or diagrams, because it doesn't just make the world continuously anew, it actually brings all of those complex processes outside of the body and outside of the socius and outside of your expertise. It brings them back home, because if you're trained as a designer, you understand processes. You know that to create an influence down here, you sometimes have to go upstream or do something acupunctural to produce that effect. And so being able to understand processes and the intertwining and the interconnection of different elements and how substituting one part of one thing. I think about one of my colleagues was telling me that the grandmother passed on the recipes to the daughters, but withheld the one secret ingredient that gave it its flavor as a way to control, the pure energy of the food that was provided in the family. So the daughters couldn't pass the missing ingredient to their daughters. And so the genealogy was broken. And that meant everyone was trying to reconstruct that missing ingredient through different variations and experimentations in the cooking of this Punjabi cuisine that I couldn't pronounce. Anyway, I bring this up because process philosophy for me is also the ability to see not just things in process, but what in second order cybernetics is called dual feedback loops. Two things that are moving or oscillating start to reciprocate and produce effects with them. You can see these amazing videos that say you take a whole bunch of different types of moving elements. If you think like the metronomes from music, if you put them on a trampoline, they'll all start harmonizing with each other very quickly, right? Heart cells, when put together, start to beat simultaneously too. This is all part of understanding not just process philosophy, but complexity science too. So it means that in my world, the 10-year-old me that everyone thinks is a professor, in my world, anything can connect to anything. And this is one of the superpowers I discovered in design school. Okay, so I normally take a break after about an hour, get some water. So I've got about, I think, 10 minutes, and then I'm going to take a water break and give everyone 5 minutes to, I don't know, do yoga, go karate, whatever you want to do, play with your cat. But in that meantime, I'm also going to give you a little bit of a thinking assignment, and you can do this as a written assignment. Because I live in the Himalayas, I've been often fascinated with trying to explain to people what are the Himalayas. And I often in class will do this as a mental exercise too. How do you represent, or even better, how do you diagram the Himalayas? So this is my little thought exercise while you're taking your power naps during the 5-minute break coming up. This is one way to think about it. This is not the Himalayas. This is the Mississippi River in the United States. And this map, this probably ties into last week. This map was done by the U.S. Geographical Survey. So, some very, high-powered, harumphing civil engineers, probably with the big, walrus mustaches in the 1800s and their spy pieces, went out and mapped the boundaries of the Mississippi River every year. And what this map is actually like a slow motion stop action cartography. This is 100 years of the position of the Mississippi River in the North American continent. You notice that the Mississippi River changes its position over time. Heraclitus, our favorite pre-Socratic philosopher, to illustrate the idea of a world of pure becoming where there's no permanent and durable essences, Heraclitus said, you can never step into the same river twice. The U.S. Geographical Survey says the Mississippi is not where you think it is. And this map is one way to think about, not a mountain, but a river, and how the river itself as an entity maintains its identity, its singularity, and at the same time, its boundary conditions are constantly in flow and in flux. A different way to think about it, and this is also an attempt at mapping the complexity of rivers. This is probably getting closer to the data visualization of contemporary times. Just take all the snakes and line them up. Here, every single river in North America, with us, North America, has been organized by, so that they're accurate representations of the rivers. But you can see they've been organized by type and by a degree of complexity and by length, right? So that's always one of the bigger criteria, as if there's some relationship in terms of the length and the width of the delta that it comes out with. There's a bunch of other things that get involved in it. Manuel Delanda, in his book on ontology, said the Mississippi River is basically a machine for sorting rocks, which is, I think, depreciating the value of the complexity of the river. But he actually did say that too, because in some ways, rivers do sort rocks. And where we live in the Himalayas, we've got one river on one side of our village and then a dry riverbed on the other side, which has these incredibly smooth rocks in the Himalayas with seashells in them, because they were also below the water at some point too. So just looking at these two different modes of representation of the indeterminacy and the flux and the flow of rivers, what if we take that question to the mountains themselves? The way to map the river is through myth. And here you can see the Naga water spirits. I believe that might be Krishna hanging out in the Kangra Valley. That's where I live. That's a Kangra painting. I know those aren't the gopis, but this is another way to understand how a river works, through processes of enchantment. In Jane Bennett's book about re-enchantment and the politics of matter, talks very much about this ability for us to find within material processes and the new materialism, it's called, these processes of demystification, remystification, going back to, say, even some of Max Weber's arguments about how modernity was supposed to disenchant the world. And the period we're in now is all often about re-enchanting the world too. And here you can see some visual similarities of, that slippery river and that boundary condition between land and sea, and the slipperiness of the scales of the nagas and the serpents. And all of the world is coiling and uncoiling. And these become figures and representations, not as entities, but of coiling and uncoiling relationships. Nature itself and the landscapes are, in process and active. This is where the painter Paul Cézanne famously said, "I think the landscape and the landscape thinks through me. All of my paintings are the landscape thinking itself through me." This is not quite the view out of our front window, but it's close. This is what I see from our library. This is Alexander von Humboldt, the inventor of the modern university, who argued that for the university to be viable in the 1800s, all the teaching had to be informed by research. He radically transformed epistemology and the disciplinary knowledge of universities by requiring those who teach to research and those who research to teach. The German model, which infiltrated the UK and the Americans by the 19th century, gave rise to a whole range of new sciences, including the human sciences. Now, Humboldt traveled the world and he developed the first theory of ecology, or one of the first theories of ecology, arguing that nature stratifies and it clumps together, those are my words, not his, different organisms and elements in naturally occurring zones. So here you can see he never was able to get funding to go to the Himalayas. And, I love the fact that they look like, I don't know, a crown tooth or upside down ice cream cones. He's drawing the Himalayas from conjecture and from written descriptions, because this is before photography, and showing how even in the Himalayas, which is actually the case, that there are different levels of ecological subsystems or microecologies, and that they are stacked, just as he had discovered when he physically explored the Amazon and he found nested ecologies, not his term, but our contemporary times. I have a colleague who came up and visited us who's an expert on Himalayan botany. And he said, south of the Himalayas, there's 160 language groups. North of the Himalayas, there's 3. South of the Himalayas, there's hyperbiodiversity, including things that don't follow the laws of evolution. The mutations happen much too quickly and much too dramatically because of the hyperfertility of the part of the Himalayas that traps the monsoon rains. And we also have this argument about monotheism comes from deserts, polytheism comes from, and tantric religions all come from the green side of the Himalayas too. So there's something about the correspondence, and you've been looking, cultural formations of temples and things too, that once an ecology reaches a certain degree of fertility or intensity, it starts to have implications and ramifications far beyond the biological or the zoological. And that this is something that is part of that system, like I said before, the aprons of these tendrils and connections moving beyond the physical boundaries of things and extending into the world. This is probably more conventional undergraduate data visualization. These are looking at the different volcanoes and mountains of the world. And you can see the Himalayan ones are quite significant as the oldest mountain chain. So one way you could diagram the Himalayas is to pick out all of the peaks and to create something like this, where it's, again, data visualization of their height, or it doesn't even get the proportions right. So this is, in many ways, a reductivist diagram. The more powerful diagrams show what I think is the most important thing. The Himalayas are alive and they're moving, and they're really big. So there's a film, I won't show it, but you can find it. And it shows the original, the Pangea single continent that arose. Earth at one point was all water, and this is the Babylonian creation myth. Apparently, the Hebrews read from right to left and not left to right, so they misinterpreted the Babylonian panels where the world started off as a flood, whereas in the Old Testament the flood comes at the end because it's backwards. But there's a pan-geographic singular continent, and even small children recognize Africa and South America look like they belong together, right? And if you watch the animations of the spread and the dissolution of these, all of the continents that we have now, including the submerged one that basically just has the tip of New Zealand left. They were all spreading out, except for part of Africa near Madagascar broke off, going the wrong way and crashed up into Asia. And, like any driver in Delhi, that's the Indian subcontinent going the wrong way, crashing, and it's still crashing. Millions and millions of years later, if you look at this stop motion diagram on the left, which I think is a really good diagram, red arrows are kind of cheesy, but you get the idea. And you can see where early India today, obviously those of you in long-term spec design that are interested in deep time, where will India be in 10 million years? It's going to be way up past Mongolia. And so this process continues. And the diagram on the right is better than mapping the Himalayas as mountains. It's mapping the tectonic forces. And it's showing that, like the pleats of matter or the layers of the skin, they're all in motion. They're all doing their own thing. They're laminar and they're going in different directions slightly. And it's producing all these interesting forms of turbulence and friction. And from that comes the hyperdiversity of language groups, of clothing, of biological diversity. The more chaos you have, my friend Ayaz, I would say, the more creativity you get. And this is a little more of a static one, showing again, justifying what Humboldt thought he would find, different microecologies distributed across horizontal and vertical space and creating worlds within worlds. Back before spec design, the best way of doing fortune telling was actually winging it. And one of the things that became heavily codified in the process of trying to foretell the future was a misplaced belief that not only is the future knowable, but the future is an extension of the present. So the argument often was that it doesn't include models of the future for a long time, rarely included something that Taleb would call the black swan event, the unthinkable, or something like an eclipse, because if an eclipse happened and it wasn't predicted, then everybody had to die too. So fortune telling in many ways is actually a reactionary process of trying to understand the future as being, Laurie Anderson in a song once said, heaven is a lot like where you are now, just much, much better. And this is in many ways the naive extension that there is no differentiation, deviation, or mutation between the present and the near future in most forms of the early attempts to extend pattern recognition into the future. And this is one of the examples I sometimes will ask people. I'm not expert at palm reader, but I've encountered a great many people who claim that they are. And the science behind it seems quite arbitrary. And actually what's more powerful about it is the diagnostic process. And this is what I want to get to in terms of spec design too, because we all have these lifelines and headlines. And, if yours is broken or if yours stops arbitrarily, that's a bad thing. Right? Because actually what matters in the process of fortune telling, I would argue, is actually those aspects that are soft skills. And it's been argued by others, this is not my argument, that all designers are potentially natural leaders because the soft skills that are necessary for leadership today are actually design skills. And so I've pinched this poster from, I think, a UX UI web design site. The attribution's missing because a lot of the text has been stripped off, unfortunately. But these are the 4 powers of leadership that are very effective, particularly in contemporary times of conflicting narratives and data insecurity. The first one, obviously, will be familiar to most of you who are in design, is empathy, your ability to not just imagine others or the alterity of the unimagined other, but also understanding different degrees of empathy as it moves from recognition to sympathy to shared suffering would probably be at the extreme edge of empathy. And there's people that have mapped the different degrees of empathy, even in terms of neuroscience and cognitive data. The second skill that you already have that makes you both a designer and a natural leader is pattern recognition. And this is actually one of our more powerful tools. All those stupid CAPTCHA programs that are trying to train the driverless vehicles not to hit bicycles that we participate in are just not at the same level of pattern recognition that we have. You'll notice that your pattern recognition skills often, like chicken sexers, you can't explain it, you can just do it. And pattern recognition is actually a crucial leadership skill, particularly in times of complexity, times of indeterminacy, or more often than not, times when the data is incomplete, but you still have to make a legally binding decision. The third skill that designers have that are actually leadership skills is the ability to synthesize. And this is the one that I've been emphasizing at the beginning of my talk too. My surrealist tendencies, which are activated by seeing Salvador Dali's work as a young teenager and listening to Pink Floyd's music and seeing a relationship between those two things. The ability to synthesize is to bring Ratatouille, when he says you take one thing and another thing and you put them together, and the thing they make is better, right? Greater than the sum of its part. Ratatouille shows the basic secret of alchemy in that film about the cooking. And this is the magic. And he also said anyone can cook, so anyone can actually learn how to synthesize the dissimilar. I was thrown out of an art history program once because they said the problem with you designers is you can turn a poem into a teacup. And I said, that's our superpower, buddy. That's not a liability. And they're like, that's not science. And I was like, duh, it's not. And they're like, get out and don't come back. Right. So that was, policing the perimeter of a particular reactionary art historical program in the United States, where they couldn't tolerate that something would transform into something else. I feel sad for those kinds of people, particularly the art historians, because we're in a world where everything is transforming constantly, including ourselves, even to the point where we can't keep up with it. But the most powerful part of this, and this is what fortune tellers are good at, and other types of visionaries that have some sort of communication relationship with the future, is the storytelling capacity. When I was the dean of an art and design school in New Zealand, they said, we need to have a clear vision for the school. And that whole idea terrified me. So I showed them pictures of praying mantises that have their big compound eyes. And I'm like, how about that? And they're like, no, not like that. And I was like, what do you want? Like a cyclops, one clear vision? They're like, yeah, that's what we want. And I said, okay, a design school is a big dream machine. And they're like, no, that's too touchy-feely, right? And then I said, a design school is a place for producing narratives. And they're like, you're right. So the idea that there could never be a singular narrative was the narrative. So the ability, the storytelling capacity, and we'll come back to this in a minute, is actually something that can also be learned and taught. And particularly in cultures and civilizations like in the Indian subcontinent, where oral traditions have historically been the place where ideas and concepts and abstractions are tested out, storytelling is of supreme importance in a time when there is chaos. Diegetic space is a technical term to describe a world inside a constructed world where the characters, the environment, the plants, the animals, the forces, don't look up, the meteorite, all coexist hypothetically and are conscious and aware and interact with each other, usually oblivious to what is outside of that world, which include the spectator and the filmmaker or the composer that's creating that world. A diegetic space is a sealed off story world that is composed of interactions that duplicate and simulate our phenomenological understanding of the body moving through the flesh of the world, but it's almost like in miniature form. It's a world within a world, or if you think like the first Men in Black, where there's an entire galaxy on a little necklace, or the better example of that, where the idea came from, Horton Hears a Who, where there's an entire civilization on the end of a dandelion, right? All of those are diegetic spaces that are excellent, and they follow from, say, Leibniz's discovery of the levels of infinity when he looked through the first microscope and saw little beasties crawling around. And he said, our worlds are composed of just smaller and smaller, finer grained worlds, right? He was onto something because he said it goes up and down. In a story world, there is a fourth wall, if you look at the bottom, where you're in the audience watching the stage, or you're on the sofa watching the Netflix. And that fourth wall is the glass aquarium wall, or the former cathode ray glass screen on the television, that separates this performative world, which can have its own laws, its own technological novum, its own rules, and the so-called real world outside of it. We now live in an age where the fourth wall has not only been dissolved, we don't need it, and the so-called real world and the story world, they haven't switched places with each other. They haven't lost their identity. They've created this very complex hybrid, right? So one of the first actors in Bertolt Brecht, who developed the theory of alienation, when the actor on stage turns to the audience and says, "I am an actor on stage reading words to you." That was a very big transgression. Nowadays, we would take that for normal, that the fourth wall, that threshold or that boundary between the real and the unreal, between the outside and the inside, is in many ways unnecessary. And this means also that the diegetic space and the ability to construct different types of diegetic worlds, right? Imagine a world, say, in solar punk where there's no petroleum products. That could actually leak out into everyday practice and vice versa. But this fourth wall, as you can see, is as shown here, the gap between the fantastical and the real, that gap is actually becomes like a thick space that is neither inside nor outside, but something in between. Most of you who are in spec design will be familiar with the cone of possible futures. So this is an advancement. On the upper left is actually a diagram that we will start with in a few minutes. We do our mutant exercise. So you start from a point in time and then you project time as a linear extension, right? It's very much a Euclidean model there. And the idea that this is also a bit like if you are playing darts and you've had a couple drinks, you can still see the bullseye, but there's a whole range of options available to you, including when I was in the UK, people throwing darts in each other's feet as a consequence of, say, cricket or soccer match results. This idea that there's a range of possible targets or that there's a range of possibilities, it's just spatializing a probabilistic model. And one of the things that's missing from this, I would argue, is a lot of the things that I showed in the first half, which are these dynamic interflow of forces that are invisible but produce effects. So something that is invisible and produces an effect at a distance in the theories of, say, Alfred Gell, Simone Denn, Marcel Mauss, was called magic until the technology or science was understood, and then it actually became tech. But the ability to produce effect at a distance was often, in many places, seen as something that is magical or a superpower. And we'll get to that in a minute too. But this Foresight cone, imagine if you had compound eyes, how many different types of futures you could see at the same time. Or if you were just a cyclops and you didn't have depth perception, imagine how all of these possible futures would actually all be interchangeable film stills. So when I teach in MBA programs, and the MBA students, some of them struggle with the idea of not strategy but foresight, and the idea that there's multiple possible futures, or that you could actually have people all living in different futures. I've been in meetings in many countries where someone at the table is in the 21st century, someone's in the 19th, and someone's in the 5th. And you're like, how can we all be in the same country operating with these very different understandings of the universe? In strategic foresight, you don't just stop with the projection of possible range of futures. As you look towards the development here, the strategic vision, and probably the most important part is the planning stage, scenario-based planning. Another way to talk about this is the future is composed of many, many bubbles that are each diegetic spaces, and they could have similarities and differences, but this is not quite a multiverse or multi-world model. It's saying that there's a plurality or a multiplicity of ways forward. Some things would be obviously more different than others. So the scenario becomes, in many ways, the vision capturing machine for the production of new forms of imagining the future. And if we extend the idea of the present becoming the future, we can start to not just describe simple values like preferable or impossible, but we can also start to anticipate the unthinkable, the unimagined, or the incomprehensibly wonderful possibility of scenarios too. The gap or the distance between the present and the future, if you see the future as, say, a constellation or cluster of these different hypothetical scenarios, then the world becomes fascinating again. And it doesn't seem to lock you into what increasingly is being pushed out as a pessimistic or nihilistic abandonment or absence of the future, like in Mark Fisher's writing, where he argues in Capitalist Realism that capitalism takes away any dreams of alternate futures and forces you into realism where there's only one inevitable conclusion. This is what designers will fight. Henri Bergson was perhaps one of the most pioneering thinkers of radical subjectivity in a time of the late 19th and early 20th century. Two of his powerful arguments is that one, time is a subjective construct, and he said time is actually composed of durations. And you can understand this intuitively. If you've ever worked retail and you feel like 10 hours have passed and you look up and the clock has only moved 2 minutes, that's very different than, say, being in a moment of extreme intensity and joy and discovering that 4 hours have passed. So he made this argument that duration and that all sorts of subjectivities, events, objects, everything has a duration to it. It was only about 80 years after that that the earliest 2D and 3D modeling software started to have timelines ascribed to the Euclidean objects and primitives that were being made. So in the Bergsonian model, everything has timelines to it, and these vary. And it was very influential in, say, Marcel Proust on his Remembrance of Things Past, where each chapter is the same length, but some of them describe just a few seconds and some of them describe an entire decade. So time for him is something that dilates. Time, subjective time, dilates and can expand and contract. And you're always in a moment of pure presence. Your brain, your sensory apparatus, you live in a continuous present. And yet all of these things that happen to you become instantaneously cinematic images that are memories. He said the human consciousness is structured like cinema. And he was writing at the time when the first black and white non-sound films were coming out. He said human consciousness is cinematic fundamentally. And because of that, it's the stream of these images that start to, over time, weigh down on you. Another way to think about it is the stylus of an LP record player. The stylus is touching a few molecules, and that's being interpreted as sound. The stylus does not know what sound comes before or after, but your consciousness and your memory stores that. And so you have both the recent memory of the sounds that have occurred and anticipation of the sounds to come. This is the basis for Bergson's idea that the pure present also starts to dilate. It starts to become elliptical and stretch a little bit into the past and a little bit into the future. It's also a form that is commonly used to describe temporality at the first part of the 20th century. We're looking at three different models here. The first one on the left is by, that's William Butler Yeats from his book called A Vision, where he and his wife would have seances, and these disembodied messengers, these angels, would project images of the future and tell them about the different ages of man. You can see that his diagram on the left. He argued that time is the intersection of two cones. It's kind of like the continuously variable transmission I had when I owned a Mini Cooper. There's no gears per se, but they intersect each other. The past and the future in William Butler Yeats' model are two cones. And when they're clearly and heavily intersecting, you have a period of stability. When the past and the future create an equilibrium in the present, you have stability. When the gyres separate and the past and the future no longer touch or interlock, then you have periods of incredible chaos, which he thought came every 2,000 years, including the devastation of the earth and a rebooting. And he's writing this right at the end of World War I. So for him, time is two cones intersecting and interpenetrating. And the upper right is the diagram of Bergson again, showing the dilation of time. S in that diagram is the instant or the moment that you're in. And the big disk of A and B is the weight and the pressure of all your memories, pushing down on how you actually, as a stylist, see or perceive the particular moment. So this also follows from Nietzsche's argument in his essay, The Use and Abuse of History. He said an animal that has perfect recall and memory would be paralyzed from action and would die. That to live is to forget. And so for him, the highest form of mankind, writing at the same time as William Butler Yeats, actually about a decade before, he argues that it's only in the absence of memory that freedom can occur. And yet Bergson, in his book, Matter and Memory, was arguing that memory is the device that actually gives us the presence and the centering on the moment that we're in. And Minkowski in the lower right, this is an illustration, the dual cone again, but this is actually about how past and future light passes through a particular point of time in relativity theory. So this is actually before the black hole phenomenon, but it's a diagram from physics right at the time where relativity theory was morphing into quantum mechanics. This is, I think, the diagram that got him the Nobel Prize, Minkowski, in astrophysics. The most powerful diagrams I've discovered. I found this in a book of anthropology by an obscure but very clever anthropologist, Alfred Gell. In his book, The Anthropology of Time, and then his magnum opus, which was published after he died, called Art and Agency. Let me unpack this diagram for you for a couple minutes, because this is tying into this. In his model, and this is literally from Edmund Husserl, again, who Derrida first wrote about. And Husserl's diagram, he's a philosopher, and he's diagrammed how time perception works. He was obsessed with the idea of time consciousness. Now, Nietzsche was obsessed with the idea of eternal recurrence and what happens at time, and things repeat exactly the same over and over again. At the same time, Carl Jung was obsessed with the idea of synchronicity and what if, the so-called non-causal relationships between two unrelated things that happen simultaneously are actually connected somehow, and you work that out with the physicist Paul Lee in his book on synchronicity. Husserl was also obsessed with this question of how do we actually understand time, and for him, time consciousness was the chronic problem. His tentative answer here, there's actually the best way to unpack this diagram is to understand it's a triangle. I want you to focus and look at the triangle. Look for the heaviest lines. The darkest lines here is actually the secret of this diagram. The bottom line on the left is past or memory, and on the right is future and projection. In between, it says feed forward from past to future. This is our conventional understanding of how past comes into future, and it's a linear system. The radical hypothesis that Edmund Husserl, the transcendental phenomenologist, brings out is that the present, this instant that we're in right now, oh, there goes one, oh, there goes another one, oh, there goes another one, is not part of the past or the future. So instead of putting the present in between the past and the future held in tension, he says it's an entirely different nature of reality that has no relationship to past and future. This is disturbing and radical. The present is outside of the past and the future. You would be ahistorical. You would be the Nietzschean ideal, where people could talk and see images of the past and future. If you saw the dramatization of Philip K. Dick's first novel, The Man in the High Castle, where there's multiple futures that some of the travelers can pass to, they brought the films back to give people that sense. The present is a localized condition that has no relationship to the past or the future. It's a continuous presence. That is, for Searle, the basis of consciousness. Now, where it gets really freaky, whether you accept it or not, you still have to understand the triangular diagram. By pulling the present out of the past and future, he breaks everything. Then he does something even freakier. And this gets us into Christopher Nolan territory. The two diagonal strong arrows, one is called protensions and one is called retentions. Retentions are a second of the instant of awareness or being in the moment as it passes into memory. It is a downward diagonal line. It is a fall, right? It's like Icarus under the sun, going down, Mayday, Mayday. The present as an instant is already gone the moment you conceptualize it or try to think about it or picture it. It's already gone. You're no longer in the present. And he calls that a retention. And you can see how, if you're anal retentive, you save everything. You'd be completely crippled by all your memories. You wouldn't be able to do anything. Retentions are the present collapsing into the past. It is a fall from grace. It is a fall into time from a timeless place of perpetual present. Where it gets really freaky is the other part of this triangle, right? So the one we haven't talked about, protensions. Protensions And I'll show you the diagram from Tenet in a couple of minutes to prove this. Protensions mean in the same way that all of our experiences can become memories, there's actually future memories that haven't happened that are already determining our present. Protensions, in Nick Land's theories of CCRU, he called this hyperstition, events in the future over determining the present. So that cone isn't actually in play anymore, our projection cone. It's been flipped around. In Tenet, the future is at war with the present. Protensions are things that are happening in the future, which we can't know in our endless stream of being immersed in the moment, right? Think of the most ADD moment you've ever had where you're just like, completely unaware of the passage of time, or there is no time. And the protensions are hitting you. The imagined futures are not protensions. Protensions are lively forces in the same way that the fall into the past, the Icarus fall, protensions are Lucifer rising from his prison back up into his exalted position, which he used to hold. Right? So if you can grab that. Again, Philip K. Dick, one of the prophets of this idea of multiple temporalities. This is a film adjustment bureau. And in a adjustment bureau, the lead actor and the lead actress, the moment they meet and encounter each other, the world changes. And so there's a whole legion of bureaucrats with hats that are devices that allow them to travel through space. And they have this continuously updating real-time map of all the possible conditions of the world. They are tasked by this invisible agency. This is pure Philip K. Dick paranoia, of conspiracy theories. And they have to never meet, because the moment they meet, the world changes. Right? This is the definition of love. This is the definition of the event in philosophy. It's something that is both unintentional and irreversible, right? Like modernity itself. It didn't happen to have to happen that way, but once it did, you can't go back. And in Adjustment Bureau, they actually have this graphic of this map continuously updating and showing how the world changes if these two people do encounter each other. It's a type of future projecting into the present. A more simple diagram of it, if you remember our cone, the present event, and you can see coalescent divergent futures. That's our cone of future situations. On the right, this is influenced by Nick Land, the cataclysm now. Diabolical forces of the future are shaping our present more than our past. And in this model, it's a reversal of polarity, but actually the other one is still present. So this is where it gets interesting. Again, you have the past moving into the present, and you have the future pushing back into the present. So the present is always in tension. And in many ways, the present is, the servant of two harsh masters that are not in agreement. The plot diagram, one of many from Tenet. There is a forward and a backwards timeline, pink and blue. And he color-coded it in the film. He worked on this for 10 years. It's actually quite a sophisticated representation because every event happens twice in the film, because it's all about palindromes. Tenet is a palindrome. The names, the rotas wheel from the Roman Empire, all the character names all come from this palindrome situation of something going forward and then coming back again too. And in that diagram, and if you remember the film Tenet, I'm going to teach a course, I think, next year called Making Sense of Tenet. I tried to explain to MBA students and I failed. I couldn't get them to get this, but designers, I think you can get this. The future determines the present equally or more than the past determines the present. For designers who hate history and like to be creative, this should be music to your ears. Right? If you're an art historian, sucks to be you. Okay. So, multiverse, anyone? For copyright reasons, I won't tell you where this is from or who did it, but if you look closely, you might be able to figure it out. How do you feel about characters living in multiple timelines? My first question is always, will they remember the alternate timelines if they go backwards, and will the other characters? And so this is made very, very explicit in, say, Umbrella Academy, if you watch the series. where each season they have a different timeline, but some of the characters remember the previous timeline and other characters don't too. So in a multiverse model, time has become this braided network of possibilities. It is like a craziest subway map, and it's quite literally often shown as subway maps in different franchises to show different connections from different points. The multiverse also is a construct, not as a AR/VR thing, but as a idea of multiple realities or points of convergence of different planes of reality. Goes back to some of the oldest thinking in Western civilization and questions about the entanglement of subjectivity and time, which is I find a fascinating project. Again, Husserl's time consciousness. How do you know that time exists? How are you conscious of time? In the same way that the hard problem of consciousness is how do you know that you're knowing, or how do you know that your consciousness is working too? In this context, the present, as you can see, is highly relative depending on which timeline and which character you are in one of those timelines. So in the time we have left, perfect, right on schedule. I worked with Carlos in Australia, and my colleague developed a Mutant Futures program, which I am now officially a member of. And he came up with this idea that the only way to deal with the wicked problems of the universe is to first and foremost, following the ideas of Joseph Campbell, amongst others, before you address the wicked problem, you have to create a new myth of yourself or turn yourself into a new sort of mutant or hybrid creature. And then once you have yourself transformed by myth and metaphor, once you have a new narrative of yourself, like as Echo Warrior or as, in my case, Surrealist Librarian, then you develop a method to spread that to others, because you can't fix anything yourself, right? The techniques, strategies, and methods used to create change. So you have to rebrand yourself or recast yourself as a deviation or a mutant of yourself. Then from that comes new methods that are coming from the narrative, and those new methods allow you to signal jam the same old status quo, so that you can actually affect social change and transitions in the world. It's a powerful and simple thing. And he and I go back and forth because I said it should be a circle. He's like, no, it's a triangle. I'm like, no. Triangle has to do with, displacements of temporality. It should be a circle. And, he's like, I might change the Mutant Future triangle to a circle next year. So I might have to write a book in response to his book. I'm getting ahead of the game there. So what I would like you to do, this is something that designers, particularly in service design and other fields, event planners would also know this. This is the quintessential user journey map. So I would like everyone to take out a piece of analog or digital paper, or get your tablet. I would like you to draw a timeline through the middle. See the horizontal from, what's your earliest memory? 3 years, 4 years, 5 years? Your 0 point for your graph is going to be your earliest memory on the left-hand side of the page. And you just run a timeline, the positivist linear time to the right to whatever age you are. Like I'm 10, so every one of the years of my timeline says 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, because I refuse to grow up. But you might have different results your way. Basically, you just make a very quick timeline, spend less than a minute on it, your first memory to now. You can subdivide it if you want, like a ruler or a scale into, you could do it into zones. I have a friend who catalogs his life by which illness he had at one point in his life. I have people who catalog their lives by what continent they're living on, right? People who are looking at, how well their bank account was doing year by year, whatever it takes. But before we get into that, I just want you to do basically a line that's going to be our central baseline. So run it through the center of the page, like in this user diagram. And spend no more than a minute doing that line. Okay, you got that? Don't overthink it, especially you 20-year-olds. Just do it. Okay, now I want you to do your timeline. Here's an example for those of you that like examples. This is a girl And I want you to map on your chronological timeline at least 3 emotional peaks and 3 unpleasant moments. And I'm just going to pull some of these out here that you can see. Learn to ride a bike at 5 years. That's a good thing, right? Getting a cat, that was a really good thing. Myrtle Beach was a good thing, right? Getting a car is at the top, right? So those are, in this case, I'm pretty sure this is an American because getting a car at 16 is an American thing, but these are also forms of liberation, right? Different cultures will have different, ideas of peak experiences, but map your peak experiences, do 3 at least, you can have more, and tag them. And then at least, 3 down points, low points. One of my alcoholic friends said, I've hit rock bottom so many times it feels like a second home. I was like, you're supposed to hit rock bottom once. What's wrong with you? And he's like, I go there all the time. Right. So if that's you, that's fine. It's your life. But you can see, the worst one for this person was grandma dying. Right. And then there's some other sad things too. So you should have something, and it should like an emotional EKG or some sort of seismic diagram of the experiential quality of your life, and just map it. 3 and 3 at least. You can have more, and I would just give you about 2 minutes to do that. In my case, 10 was a really good year. On my 50th birthday, I went to work because in Australia, you can take your birthday as a national holiday. I went to work in Australia on my 50th birthday. I had everyone buy me ice cream. I had 14 ice creams and I almost got diabetes. So my 50th birthday was good. But you'll have peak experiences and you'll have times where you really felt like you were yourself and things were going great. And then you have times that are sometimes so awful you don't want to discuss them or think about them. But they are part of that timeline, and it does create a system. And as you can see, it starts to differentiate qualitatively. And sometimes those periods of feeling yourself might be quite long, but they feel short. And sometimes those periods of suffering might be quite short calendar-wise, but they might be quite intense too. So don't be obsessed with the calendar. Do an honest emotional seismograph of your highs and lows. You got that? Okay. So yours should look equal or better to the one we're looking at there. Now, now we're going to add another layer. So you've got your two-dimensional line. You've got a second line. Now, this is a little conceptual work. I'm going to argue that within you, there are multiple mutant selves that have not yet been fully activated. One way to think about this is the dumber version is called the alternate personality. But I'll give you some examples. A mutant self is a possible you that could have become powerful, great, centered, but didn't. And this one gets very personal because no one will know. There was a point where I was a teenager and I was offered a chance to become a semi-professional soccer player, believe it or not. And I was going to go into play and become a professional soccer player. They had a whole plan worked out. My parents were like, no. And I was like, I guess I better go back to that architecture thing. So I have a mutant self that actually was a statewide and potential world-class soccer player. And the mutant self only expressed itself when I coached children's soccer. Okay. I was in university, I was an undergraduate, and I was approached by some professors who formed a band called my band was called the Enemies of Art. We kind of modeled ourselves after this obscure band called the Talking Heads. And so they saw me performing and they asked me to join their band, which is called the Vulgar Boatmen. And they said, but you have to practice 6 hours a day and we're going after our first record. And if we get it, we're all going to quit our jobs and become musicians. And I said, but I'm in architecture school. I don't have 6 hours a day to play music. So twice in my life, I was offered a career-changing opportunity to become someone other than I am. There's probably others that I've forgotten. I used to be really good at math, so I thought at some point I would probably be a mathematician. I've asked students to do this, and I've been surprised to find everything from people who were top ballet dancers or chess masters to gamblers. So I would like you to identify 2 to 5 mutant selves that you could have been, should have been, would have been, but weren't. And you can do it as a simple list, but then I want you to tag it on your emotional timeline. Because what happens when you do that, you'll often notice that these mutant selves appear very close to the peaks or valleys. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Make a list of your alter egos that coulda, shoulda, woulda been, and then map them on your timeline and spend no more than 5 minutes doing that. And enjoy your nostalgia and the Wayback Machine. And, if you're like most of the undergraduates I talk to, if you're going to be a cricket player, I'd be like, great, get it in there. When were you the best, or when were you the most in love with cricket? When was cricket the center? Map that, even if you played for 20 years, map that point. So identify your alter ego / mutant self, and then tag it onto your line, and then look at that pattern. Again, you're all designers, so you should have pattern recognition skills. You will find correlations. It's not that I'm smart, and it's not that I know what you're doing. There's a reason for this. And we're going to do one more step after that. And then we'll have time for questions. What I usually do, if we do this online, this exercise, I do this once or twice a year, not all the time. I ask you to, if you're brave, to type in the chat box the list of the mutant future or mutant selves that you've been or could have been. Now, you can make something up, I wouldn't know, but you know. And if you're comfortable enough sharing some or all of your mutant selves, if you share it with coworkers, you may intimidate some of them. You never know. You may impress some of them. If you share it with everyone here in the class, you may be surprised. What if there's 2 chess masters in the class? Right? Will it be like Highlander where there's sparks and only one can survive? I don't know. But if you want to share, do share. I guarantee all of you have at least 1, if not 5 mutant selves. And if you just spend some time identifying them, then you can start to narrativize them. You can start to create myths around them. You can start to reanimate them. Or as I explained to the students who were cynical, Hulk smash. When Hulk comes out, Hulk smash. So we'll get to that step next. But you got to know that you're a mutant Hulk and not a Spider-Man. I'll give you 2 more minutes to identify and map your mutant selves. Maybe you're the most alive on the stage. Maybe you're the most alive singing in the shower. I think if I hadn't become an academic, I would have gone for stand-up comedian. Here we go. Yeah. Hallucinatory, soldier, arsonist, gypsy, and aeronautical engineer. Yeah, this is right. This is how you're supposed to do it. Your mutant selves, when you start to objectify them this way, will realize how rich your life has been and how rich your imagination probably still is. Because I guarantee you, those mutants are still kicking around in there. Army, dancer, cook, brilliant. Okay, we've got those. Everyone's happy with yourselves. You've mapped it onto your diagram. Have you noticed any correlations about when the mutants first appear? World-class skater. All right, you're speaking my language. 6 hours of practice a day, no friends, restrictive diet. I was like, yes, I want it. I want it all. Last thing I'm going to give you in the few minutes we have left is, because you have mutant selves, each of your mutant selves, by definition, must have at least 1 superpower. This is too hard for you to see. Oh, we can zoom in. You can find this online. These are all the superpowers you could possibly have, and it's missing all the design ones, like bending reality, thinking in time in reverse, stuff like that. There's a whole bunch more they haven't captured, but you get the idea. So if one of your mutant selves, this is an example, was a cricket player, and that was your thing, and that's what your life was around, I would ask you, when you played cricket, cricket is not your superpower. Your superpower is, did you play to socialize? Did you play to dominate and crush the opposition? Did you play to get freedom from the home environment? The question is, how did you play cricket if you were a cricket mutant? Because the answer to that question actually tells you what sort of narrative to make. So when I work with dissertation students, which I do a lot, And there, one of the students was like, I'm really stuck in my dissertation. We did this exercise. His mutant self was a scientist. And I said, not which science is missing from your dissertation, but which way of being a scientist is missing from your dissertation. He's like, aha, that's the question. So how is your mutant identifiable as that mutant? Another way to say is, what is the value system or the skill set that that mutant self has, and how can you bring that to bear on your design practice, on your research, on your lifestyle? When people ask me to fill out spreadsheets, I pretend that I have dementia. I pretend I have carpal tunnel syndrome. And if they really force me, Hulk smash. I just, I just go on a rampage and break the terminal, right? So I don't do spreadsheets. That's my freedom is I can think 10 ideas at once, but I will not put them in little cells. You might be a master of spreadsheets. You might be able to compose four-dimensional spreadsheets simultaneously. More power to you. But your superpower is the qualitative, experiential, blood bubbling quality that comes from the mutant that you have inside you. So none of your mutants are dead. They're just dormant. You are the Avengers. You're the whole team. And then if you tag next to each of your mutants on your timeline, what that superpower is, and this might take you a week. This is not a quick 2-minute exercise. It take you a week. That is my gift to you, because each of those mutants is existing in a slightly different timeline, but like the multiverse, they're all there and they're all ready to interact and rumble. You just got to let them. Right? To take away from this, Hulk smash. So I said at the beginning, I would try to teach you a little bit about diagrams, abstractions, multiple temporality, and I hope I've convinced all of you that you're mutants. If that is the case, my work is done here. At that, I think we'll just throw it open to any questions or comments.